The first argument we're going to look at is a famous argument called the first cause. Sometimes it's called the cosmological argument. And this one definitely goes back to the Muslim philosophers who based it off of Aristotle. Aquinas also made this argument, also based it off of Aristotle. And the idea is that, you might remember, Aristotle talked about causes. He said everything in the universe has a purpose, has a place. So Aristotle's all about purpose. One thing leads to another thing. The seedling sort of has the potential to become the tree, and so forth. So Aristotle looked at the universe as what we now know as a naturalist, trying to figure out how the natural world works and looking at causes and effects. Now, what these theologists did with that is they said, okay, well, let's apply this logic of causes to the very beginning of the universe itself. If there are all these causes going around that Aristotle's observed, and everything seems to have a purpose or a place, it stands to reason that there was a beginning point to all those causes. There was a beginning point to that purpose. And the beginning point, of course, is God. So let's just briefly follow the premises here. And I want to emphasize that you can see the image on the right there, which is an artist's conception of our entire universe that began with the Big Bang. So it's important to realize that this idea, this argument for God, is not incompatible with evolution or the Big Bang or science. It's merely saying there was a beginning to all of this that we now understand through science. There was a starting point that led us here. So the first premise is that nothing causes itself to exist. And that's a fair premise, because when we look around, there's nothing that just spontaneously generates. I came from somewhere. My parents created me on some level, just like your parents created you. This remote didn't just spontaneously come out of nowhere. It had to be created and put together and manufactured. And look around you and your surroundings. Is there anything that didn't come from some prior event, some prior cause? Well, no, says the theologist. Everything comes from some prior cause. Secondly, something cannot come from nothing. So this is just kind of a conceptual point that's a little bit weird in a way. It's the idea that if there were ever nothing, right? If there were ever nothing at all, there's no way logically that something could generate from that, right? If there were ever nothing, there would still be nothing. Right? The fact that there is something now suggests there was something before, meaning, namely, God, that led to what we observe now being that something. So I know that's a little bit, it messes with your mind a little bit, but it's just the idea that if there was ever if there was ever an existence of nothing, we wouldn't be here, because it would just be nothing. You can't take something out of nothing. It's not logically possible. Right? It's kind of like saying you can't have a round square. It doesn't make any sense. The third premise is that an infinite series of past causes doesn't make sense, is unintelligible. In other words, if we look around and say everything has a cause, for us to argue that it would have just gone back into infinity, that, when this thing was created, that's a prior cause, right? And there was a prior cause to that thing, and there was a prior cause to the thing before that, going all the way back to the beginning on that slide where you can see the picture at the beginning point. There's a prior cause. Now, the argument suggests it would be strange if there wasn't a beginning point to these causes. We can't say everything has a prior cause and that there's no beginning, right? That seems kind of weird, according to the argument. So those three premises logically lead to the conclusion that there must have been a God to start it all. There must have been a beginning first cause to put everything into motion. Hence the name of the argument, the first cause argument. Now I want to highlight that this is a deductive argument, so remember the difference between deductive and inductive, which, by the way, is a distinction you should know for the rest of your academic career. Very important thing to know. A deductive argument takes premises that are known and draws a conclusion that is certain based on the logic above, whereas an inductive argument is more about building up evidence for a case and saying, hey, look, he had a murder weapon, he didn't have an alibi, he probably killed that person. In that latter case, the inductive argument, it could be the conclusion could be mistaken, even if the premises are true. But in the case of the first cause argument, if the premises are accurate and true, then the conclusion would have to follow with certainty. So once again, the first cause argument is a deductive argument. Those premises logically lead to the conclusion that there is a first cause. But we can still question the premises. We can still say, but are the premises accurate? Do they make sense to begin with? And let's go premise by premise. So nothing causes itself to exist is the first premise. Now, as we talked about, there's a lot of evidence for this when we observe that nothing seems to cause itself to exist, everything has a prior cause, but also notice that assumes determinism. Remember the idea of determinism from chapter 3 about the pre-Socratics? The idea that everything that's happening now is determined by a prior cause? That first premise seems to eliminate free will, which is sort of incompatible with a lot of other beliefs about God, because most people who believe in God believe he gave us free will. So there's a problem with that first premise in that sense that it suggests determinism. So that's one critique of this argument. Something can't come from nothing, and an infinite series of past causes is not intelligible. Let's discuss those two together. Because some people argue that an infinite series of past causes is perfectly intelligible. That it's possible that even before the Big Bang, there was a previous universe. In other words, there's a bunch of Big Bangs going back into infinity. And also, if we're going to use math as a guide to reality, which we do when we build buildings, when we construct computers, obviously we're using known and well understood mathematical formulas and principles to guide our creation of those things. And yet, when we look at math, are there not negative integers? There are negative infinities, right, in math, just like there are positive infinities that are worked with in high-level mathematics. So that third premise seems to be questionable. It doesn't seem that an infinite series of causes or prior numerics is unintelligible. It seems that we could have an infinite series of causes. Now, the other problem is that the conclusion of the argument, and this goes back to the filtering of theologies I was talking about before, it's not clear what the nature of the first cause is from the argument. So, of course, when the Muslim theologists made this argument, what did they say? Well, see, this proves that our God, Allah, exists. But when Christian philosophers like Aquinas made the argument, what did they say? Well, this proves that our God, the Christian God, exists. I mean, they can't both be right? And there are some people who say it's the same God, right? That's fine. But if you're going to use it to support a particular theological idea or belief, it doesn't seem justified. And let me just put it this way. There's no reason why the first cause in this argument couldn't be Zeus. Or there's no logical incompatibility there. There's no reason why. We just don't know. Even if we take this argument to be justified and good, leading to the existence of a God, it doesn't tell us the nature of that God. It doesn't tell us if it's Zeus, Allah, or the Christian God, Yahweh, if we're going by the Old Testament name. So that's one of the problems, some of the problems people have identified. But there's actually a deeper problem that people have identified with this argument, and that's that the first premise says nothing causes itself to exist, and yet God exists, according to the argument. So what caused God to exist then? Right? Where did God come from? What is the cause of God? What was the first cause of God? Now, some of you are probably already thinking you have a response if you believe in God. You say, whoa, wait a minute. God is different, right? God is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being. He's supreme. He doesn't need a cause, you might say. In other words, this objection says God is self-caused. He is an all-powerful being, so he is the cause of his own existence. So when someone challenges the argument and says, well, what caused God? You shoot back with, well, everything else needs a cause. This thing needs a cause. I need a cause. But God doesn't need a cause because he's an all-powerful being who is, by definition, a cause of himself. Now, some people don't find that answer satisfactory, but if you do, there's still another response from one criticizing the argument. So in other words, one could say, but what about the universe? Why couldn't the universe be self-caused as well? Right? So in other words, we're hypothesizing. Nobody knows the nature of God. Even if there was a first cause, nobody knows the nature. So we can hypothesize that God is a self-caused being, but it doesn't seem fair. It doesn't seem like there's no reason why we couldn't also hypothesize that the universe is a self-caused entity, right? So if we're just doing with hypothesis, we're just going to butt heads here. Now, the atheist is going to add another argument as well. They're going to bring in Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is sometimes characterized as the simplest explanation is the best. But it's really more about if you have two competing... I mean, the reason why the guy Occam created the idea is he's basically saying if you have two different theories in science and they're both basically saying the same thing, but one is way more complicated than the other, you should just go with the simpler one because it's easier to work with because they're both saying the same thing to begin with. So it's like if somebody else had come up with Einstein's theory of relativity and it was like twice as long, but it still basically said, hey, light is relative and so forth, then we would go with Einstein's because it's shorter. Now, we might apply that to God. And remember, we're trying to think of God here as an explanation for the universe. So if that's the case, many people argue, well, we need to cut God out of the explanation because it's already hard enough to explain the universe, right? We already know so little about the universe, and now we're going to add a whole entity like God before the universe to explain what's going on. That's going to make it even harder from a scientific perspective to explain. So anyways, there's a butting of heads that happens there at the end. And I want to remind you guys that we're not discussing this to convince anyone that they're right or wrong. We're just discussing this because it's part of slow thinking, because it makes us better people to think through these ideas. You don't have to resolve a debate or a discussion in order for it to be useful.